Hello. So this week we're going to be talking about privilege and oppression, and as of course all of you know, we are seeing these concepts being played out in real time currently in the news and on the streets, and through the violence and the systemic racism that we're seeing currently. So what I want to do is break down these terms a little bit and make some of those connections to the materials I've assigned for this week and to um, some of the things that are going on currently in our country. So let's start with thinking about this term privilege. So Peggy McIntosh's essay that I assigned for today on the invisible knapsack of white privilege was written in 1988, but it still is quite a important essay in terms of breaking down what white privilege is and what it looks like in our everyday lives. As she says, I have come to see white privilege as an invisible knapsack of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I am meant to remain oblivious. So much like the social construction of gender that works in terms of our everyday actions that we don't necessarily notice or acknowledge, white privilege works in kind of a similar type of way. So, Peggy McIntosh notices the advantages, the privileges that she enjoys. She lists them in her essay. And she makes the important point that she hasn't learned how to notice that these advantages are privileges that society has given her just because she was born white and for no other reason. So these are privileges every day that she experiences that she has not earned. She talks about privilege very much in an individual basis, at least in the first part of her essay. And that's important to think about. So, in our everyday actions, or in her everyday actions or everyday interactions, things that she notices, the people that she interacts with, she's experiencing privilege on an individual basis. And what she's trying to say, I think, is that it's important to acknowledge those unearned advantages that she gets to experience every day based on her whiteness and think about how noticing those individual advantages can help her understand how systemic racism works. I also want to make the connection between individual privilege and systemic racism, between white privilege and systemic racism. So, in the second part of the essay, the ending part after the list of assets that she describes in the essay, she talks about the ways in which individual white privilege is connected to systemic racism. So these are the institutional support systems to white privilege. So these are the ways in which economics, the criminal justice system, the police system, politics, the education system, how these social systems support and enable white privilege and worked as sort of foundations for systemic racism. So, as she says, these silences and denials surrounding privilege are the political tool here. They keep thinking about equality or equity incomplete, protecting an unearned advantage and confer dominance by making these subjects taboo. So, what she's trying to say here, I think, is that it's on purpose that social systems work to make white privilege something that is not discussed in a meaningful way. And then it's up to people who enjoy white privilege to acknowledge those advantages. And unless they do, we're not going to be able to talk about equity in any meaningful way. So, one of the things that happens, I think, is that white people don't think that they are part of discussions about race and racism. And as a result, they are complicit in advancing systemic racism by as a result of their silence or as a result of not acknowledging the advantages that they have as part of systemic racism. So that's what the video clips, the animations that I gave you to look at today are about. The inequality race. You can see a race that's happening, a running race here, that's the metaphor, and the systemic obstacles that the black people running the race have to encounter if they are even going to slightly catch up to the white runners, right? So you see housing segregation, you see school to prison pipeline, all of these things that are part of our social systems in this country that give white people privilege and advantage and lead to the denial of systemic racism, which is preventing true equality. So you see at the end the white man just going through on a conveyor belt, like one of those uh, escalator things that just sailing through to the winning line, as if he had made effort. And he was winning because of his hard work. That's not why. It was because he had an advantage that other people in the race didn't have, and that he didn't have to encounter the obstacles, the social systems that prevented everybody from starting in the same position. And that's what this graphic is sort of about too. So here we see the connection between individual privilege and systemic racism. So it's really important to think about these questions not just as a matter of individual interactions, but as part of a system of inequality. And so there's a lot been going on in the media today, in terms of the media and in the news and in our streets, as I said, that clearly give us a view of what white privilege looks like and what systemic racism is. I wanted just to think about this particular example because I think it does a good job of enabling a discussion of how white women are complicit in systemic racism. So you may know if we click on this link, I'm not going to play it, but you should click on the link if you haven't seen it. This is a woman in Central Park who was walking her dog off the leash. She encountered a black man who was bird watching in the park. He told her to put her dog on the leash, follow the law, and she threatened to call the police and report him, an African American man who was threatening her life. And she describes herself as a liberal, supporter of Barack Obama, and she knew exactly what she was doing in terms of weaponizing her white privilege and using a system of systemic racism that basically meant that she could threaten this African American man's life by threatening to report him to the police, by actually reporting him to the police, right? Because she knew exactly what she was doing. And so view this clip and then think a little bit about how it's an example of white privilege being weaponized in support of systemic racism and what the implications of that are in relation to these terms.